So a few of you have been wondering how the Ethiopian conflict is going to affect Eritrea and Eritreans. And a few Ethiopians have been attacking Eritreans for bringing up an Eritrea in all of this and accused us of trying to take away the attention from the people that are actually getting affected, which is only the Ethiopians apparently. So I thought I'd make this video to kind of address the fact that the Eritrean people will be affected, and also to just bring up the Eritrean perspective and experience, because a lot of times it is completely disregarded and ignored when discussing Ethiopian matters, which has had a devastating effect on the Eritrean population. So before I do that, I thought I'd give some context into the situation just to properly kind of explain how this is so closely tied to what's happening to Eritreans and how this will affect Eritreans. Ethiopia is a very big country. It has a lot of different ethnic groups. And back in the 1960s, Ethiopia had for a very long time been dominated by one of these ethnic groups, the Amharas. And at that time, Eritrea was a part of Ethiopia, but their autonomy wasn't respected, their rights weren't respected, so they decided to fight for independence. And at the same time, other ethnic groups within Ethiopia started to also fight for their rights. So the EPLF, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, was fighting for Eritrean independence, and the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, were fighting for Tigray people's rights in Ethiopia. So in 1991, when the Ethiopian regime fell, Eritrea gained independence, and the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, gained power. So from 1991, they were the ones who were in power in Ethiopia. And at first, the TPLF and the EPLF were really good friends. The leader of the TPLF, Meles Zenawi, and the leader of the EPLF, Isaias Afwerki, both became leaders of both countries, of Ethiopia and Eritrea. And they were called brothers at war. They were even rumored to be cousins. So it was a very beautiful kind of brotherhood. But in 1998, this brotherhood ended, unfortunately. And because of a border dispute where the new border between Ethiopia and Eritrea was going to be, they ended up going to war. A bloody, senseless, useless war that led to over 70,000 people dying. After this war, Ethiopia refused to withdraw its troops from the border, even though the UN awarded the territory to Eritrea. And this war ended in 2000, but the border was marcated by soldiers from the Ethiopian side, from the Tigray, who were in power at the time. And what the Eritrean regime decided to do at the same time was use this as an excuse to refuse to implement democracy in Eritrea. So Eritrea had only been independent for 10 years at the time, but they were supposed to have their first elections. They were supposed to kind of become this amazing, incredible democratic country that they've been fighting for 30 years. But instead, the Eritrean regime used the war that was happening and the standoff at the border between Ethiopia and Eritrea to justify turning the country into a complete dictatorship. And this was used for 18 years as an excuse for why the Eritrean people had to be a part of the national service indefinitely, in a national service that they were not getting properly and adequately paid to be in. People were getting in prison for expressing their opinions. Journalists, the free press was completely non-existent. Politicians were getting disappeared, put in prison. So all of this was happening with the war being used as an excuse. At the same time in Ethiopia, TPLF has gained power. But instead of kind of doing what they were promising to do to support the people, etc., they started marginalizing other ethnic groups. The Oromo people were, I would say, disproportionately affected by this. Land policies, their lands were getting were affecting them the most. Their rights were being taken away from them, their protest rights, the rights to express themselves. Other ethnic groups, of course, were also being affected, but disproportionately it was the Oromos. So they started protesting. And for a long time, the Oromo people were protesting. And finally, fast forward up until 2018, the protests were so great and so powerful that the TPLF no longer were able to rule the country. So what ended up happening was that they switched leadership. So Dr. Abiy Ahmed gained power, became the prime minister of Ethiopia, and the Oromo people were incredibly happy about this change in leadership and hopefully the change in politics in the country. So what happened in 2018, in July of 2018, was that Ethiopia and Eritrea made peace. And all over the world, people were saying, wow, this is incredible. Ethiopia and Eritrea, after 18 years of pretty much conflict, not active war, but pretty much conflict, they made peace. What a miracle, an African miracle. So we saw across the world, people, institutions, prime ministers, organizations, international organizations, congratulating the Eritrean and the Ethiopian leadership for bringing peace. But what no one was looking at was the fact that Ethiopia is a very complicated country, and the fact that Dr. Abiy Ahmed made peace with the Eritrean president does not mean that Ethiopia and Eritrea had made peace. Instead, the TPLF and the EPLF now the PFDJ, which is the party that kind of transitioned from the EPLF, had never become friends. And the fighting that had been happening and the war that had been happening was between the Tigray and the Eritreans, the TPLF and the PFDJ. So when Dr. Abiy Ahmed rose to power and he made peace with Eritrea, this whole spectacle became what some people would call a performance. They were eating cake together, they were exchanging rings, they were wearing wedding clothes, because they were trying to send a message to their common enemy, the TPLF, that they were now going to be stronger together. I'm not by any means pro-Tigray, TPLF, pro-Ethiopian government, pro-the Eritrean government. My only concern is, at large, the people, and to be very specific, the Eritrean people, and the effects that the relationship between these three groups have had on the people is absolutely, again, devastating. And the relationship is not about me looking at how the Ethiopian government and the Eritrean government is bullying the Tigray leadership or anything like that right now. It's just looking at the dynamics between their relationship, and the dynamics of which the relationship between Ethiopia and Eritrea was portrayed and branded as this love kind of like incredible story that was beyond all kind of imagination and expectations. But instead what was happening was that the Ethiopian government, led by Dr. Abiy Ahmed, and the Eritrean government were isolating and were targeting the Tigray, the TPLF, because of their own personal interests. So when peace was declared and they were celebrated for it, what was not highlighted was the fact that the border was still not demarcated, and the conflict between the TPLF and the national government was very, very, very strong. Same thing with the Eritrean government and the Tigray government. So even though the whole peace was celebrated across the world, and even though what was happening in Eritrea, everything that had been done just by justifying the war, had not changed. Nothing in Eritrea had changed following the war. The constitution has still not been implemented. People have not been released. Policies have not been lightened or anything. Nothing has actually changed in Eritrea. Even though they were celebrating that the peace was ending, they had like this whole wedding celebration. They got the peace prize. Despite all of this, nothing had changed. And Eritreans were saying, hello, why is no one talking about this? Why is no one shining light on what's happening to Eritreans? And people were saying, oh no, that's not important. Let's focus on what's happening in Ethiopia right now. Let's focus on how incredible this change is for the region, for the country, etc. And we're saying, excuse me, what's happening is that they're actually helping to solidify the regime, because now their official excuse is gone, and still they're able to continue to rule, not even on the sidelines anymore, but because of their new friendship with Ethiopia, they're now very, very much highly regarded by a lot of countries and institutions that are able to justify their support and disregard of what's happening to Eritreans by saying that they're now moving towards better days and they're transitioning into a democracy simply because the war is now over. But going back to the fact that the TPLF and Dr. Abiy Ahmed did not have a great relationship because of the historical background of the relationship between their different ethnic groups. Same thing with the TPLF and Eritrea because of their terrible relationship. Things were not great on the border, and things were not great between the Tigrays and the Eritreans and the Ethiopians and the Tigrays, or the national government and the Tigrays, the TPLF. So with that being said, what is happening now is just a continuation of the conflict that started in 1998. And it's a continuation of the hostilities and the ethnic kind of issues that we're seeing in Ethiopia between the different ethnic groups that have been at war and at conflict with each other for a very, very long time. And we've been saying this as Eritreans, that the relationship between Dr. Abiy Ahmed and Isaias Afwerki was never genuine. It was never about national interest at large. It was about very particular national interest that served both leaders, both elites really well. And the conflict that is about to happen is something that the Eritrean government has looked forward to for a very long time. You could see on social media yesterday, you could see by announcements that were happening even last week by the Eritrean government saying, game over, we're gonna do this now, that they're very, very excited to finally fight the TPLF, which is what they've been wanting to do for such a long time. And that will also continue to solidify their kind of control of Eritrea, and that will give them another excuse to continue to rule the country by fear, continue to conscript people indefinitely, which is what they've been doing since pretty much since 1998, and continue to rule again the country the way that they've been doing it. So if there would be a war to break out, first of all, Dr. Abiy Ahmed and Eritrea, the Eritrean regime, would work together very closely on this because they've been partners. During the COVID outbreak, for example, the Eritrean population have been suffering immensely. There have been completely, like, people have not been able to move freely, freedom of movement has been banned, but the Eritrean dictator has been traveling to Ethiopia all the time, and they've been planning stuff. So basically what's happening is that they're working very closely. The Eritrean government has been saying a lot of statements that suggest that they will get involved in this conflict, because this conflict is something that affects them very deeply, and they're obviously on Dr. Abiy Ahmed's side. And what will happen, and this is when we go back to how this will affect Eritreans and Ethiopians, is that if they do when they get involved, if this war will happen, they will use the conscripts from Eritrea. And every single person in Eritrea who unless you don't have like a really good excuse, is pretty much a conscript. We have people have said that we have the biggest army, but also the least motivated army in the world, which means that we have a lot of people to send into Ethiopia, or even to send at the border, which will border into Eritrea, to fight in this war. So we'll have a lot of unnecessary losses, and the Eritrean people will continue to suffer for things that have nothing to do with them, for a cause that will not benefit them at all, and just to serve a dictator who's been controlling and destroying the Eritrean people's lives for such a long time. So when we were complaining about the fact that people refused to recognize the fact that this was not a real peace, it was because because we knew that this fake peace would enable the Eritrean regime to continue to rule the country the way that they've been doing it, and B, because we knew that a fake peace ignores the existing hostilities and the existing conflicts on the ground, and that will only allow that to grow in the background and explode in the way that we're seeing it now. I am terrified. Eritreans are terrified for what this will mean for both Ethiopia and for Eritrea, and we're terrified for our people that will suffer again for something that they have nothing to do with.